Colonel's hand stopped halfway to mine, and for a second I thought he was having some kind of episode. The handshake line at the dedication had been moving along just fine, polite and forgettable, and then he looked down at the watch on my wrist and the color just went out of his face. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at that old steel watch like it had spoken to him. "Where did you get that?" he said. Not a question, really. More like he already knew and was praying he was wrong. I told him it was my grandfather's. He died in the spring. The colonel didn't say he was sorry. Didn't say anything for a long moment. And then he leaned in close enough that I could smell coffee and aftershave and said, "Lo, I need to speak with you. Not here." That was the first time I understood that the man my family had treated like a burden for as long as I'd been alive might have been somebody I never actually met. My grandfather was the quietest person I have ever known. He lived in a narrow, 2-story house at the end of Sumac Street in Marwood, Pennsylvania, a town that used to make glass and now mostly makes stew. The kind of place where the diner closes at 2 and the gas station is also the bait shop. He lived in that house since before I was born. Same recliner, same percolator that took forever, same brown cardigan with the leather buttons. He drove a truck older than me and kept it running himself. If you asked him about his life before Marwood, he'd give you this little patient smile and say, "Oh, that's all water under the bridge now." And then he'd ask if you wanted more coffee. People took the hint. Most people forgot to ask at all. My parents forgot the most. To them, my grandfather was a problem that kept not going away. He didn't have money, didn't have a pension worth bragging about, didn't have a single thing they considered useful. My father used to call him your grandfather, the way you'd say that leak in the basement. When I was a kid, I didn't understand the distance. I just knew that holidays felt colder when he was there. Like the adults were waiting for him to leave so they could relax. My mother would set him a place at the table and then talk over him the whole meal. My father would ask him, every single Thanksgiving, the same question. "You still rattling around in that old place by yourself, Walt?" Like the answer was a personal failing. When he got sick, nobody moved. The first time I heard about it was secondhand, from my mother, in the same tone she'd used to mention the weather. "Your grandfather's not doing great. Some heart thing. He won't listen to anybody, you know how he is." She said he was stubborn. She said he chose to live like that. She said he'd be fine. He was always fine. That man would outlive us all out of pure orneriness. I was working 12-hour shifts in the ICU 200 miles away, and I believed her because believing her was easier than driving home. It was his neighbor who finally called me, a woman about his age, lived across the street, the kind who watches a street the way some people watch the news. She said an ambulance had come for Walt that morning. She said she'd called my parents first, and gotten a voicemail and then a text back that just said, "Thanks for letting us know." She said somebody from the family ought to be there, and since nobody was, she'd looked me up. I was in scrubs in the break room when I read it. I put down my coffee, walked straight to my charge nurse, and told her I had a family emergency. I was on the road within the hour. I'd been a nurse for 6 years by then. I have stood at the foot of more deathbeds than I can count, and I am good in those rooms, calm, useful, the person families lean on. None of that prepared me for walking into County General and seeing my grandfather in a bed that made him look small. He'd always seemed solid to me, like furniture you couldn't move. Now there were tubes and a monitor counting out a rhythm I didn't like, and a chart at the foot of the bed that told me, in the shorthand I knew too well, that he was not going to walk out of there. He woke up when I took his hand. It took him a second to place me, and then he smiled, and it was the realest smile I'd seen on him in years. "Well," he said, his voice like gravel in a bucket. Look who remembered the old man. I told him not to talk like that. I told him Mom and Dad were on their way, which was a lie, and we both knew it. He patted my hand twice, slow. "They're not coming," he said, not bitter, just stating a fact, the way you'd read a thermometer. "And that's all right, you came. That's the part that counts." I asked him if he was scared. He thought about it. "I've been in worse rooms than this," he said. I didn't know yet how literally he meant it. He held on for 3 days. I stayed the whole time, slept in the vinyl chair, washed his face with a warm cloth, read him the box scores, because he liked baseball and hated that he'd outlived his team's good years. My parents didn't come. My brother texted me on the second day, "How's Grams holding up? Work's insane this week." and I didn't answer because I didn't trust what I'd say. On the third night, my grandfather got quiet in a way I recognized. That softening that comes near the end. And around 4 in the morning, he just stopped. No big speech. No deathbed confession. One breath. Then the space where the next one should have been. And then nothing. I sat with him until the sun came up because nobody should be alone at either end of it. When I called my mother to tell her, there was a pause, and then she sighed and said, "Well, at least he's not suffering." That was the whole of it. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask what he'd said. She didn't ask where he'd be buried because it hadn't occurred to her that someone would have to decide. I hung up and sat in the hospital parking lot and felt something cold and permanent settle into me. I planned the funeral alone. I called the only funeral home in Marwood, picked the cheapest casket that wasn't insulting, and tried to arrange military honors because I knew he'd served. Everybody knew he'd served. Everybody knew he'd served, even if nobody knew where. The funeral director was kind about it, an older man who'd buried half the town. He told me he'd need a DD to 1 Fortin, the discharge paperwork, to request the honor guard and the flag. I found a form in my grandfather's filing cabinet, but it was strange. Half the fields were blank or blacked out. The unit listed as a string of letters that meant nothing to me. The service dates oddly vague. The funeral director frowned at it for a long time and finally said the VA wouldn't be able to verify it, not with the record looking like that, and without verification there'd be no honor guard, no folded flag, no bugler. I remember thinking it was a clerical thing. A glitch. I let it go. I had 100 other things to handle and no one to share the load. 5 people came. Me. The neighbor who'd called me. The funeral director, who I'm not sure counts. The priest, who hadn't known my grandfather but did his job with grace. And one old man I'd never seen before, very upright despite his cane, who showed up in a pressed sport coat and stood at the back. When it was over, he came up to me and took my hand in both of his and said, "Your grandfather was a better man than the world ever let on. I served with him a long time ago." I asked where. He smiled, the exact same patient smile my grandfather used to give me, and said, "Oh, here and there." Then he was gone before I could ask his name. My parents did not come. My brother sent flowers to the wrong funeral home. After the burial, I went back to the house on Sumac Street to clear it out, because of course that fell to me too. It was mostly an old man's life in cardboard. Westerns taped off the TV. Coffee cans full of screws sorted by size. A toolbox in the garage that was cleaner than my kitchen. Newspapers he'd meant to read. In his dresser, in the top drawer, wrapped in a clean white handkerchief, I found his watch. A plain steel field watch, no brand, I recognized. The kind of thing you'd pass over at an estate sale. He'd worn it every day of my life. He'd wound it every night. I could picture his hands doing it. 2 careful turns, a habit older than me. I'd asked him about it once as a teenager, why he never took it off even in the shower, and he'd said, "It keeps me honest, reminds me what I'm made of." I'd thought it was just an old man being sentimental about a watch. I turned it over that night in my motel room and saw on the inside of the case back where you'd have to pry it open to look, a small etched mark. Not a serial number. Not a brand. A symbol. 2 short lines crossed by a longer one, almost like a brand you'd burn into cattle. Deliberate and strange. I had never seen it anywhere. I figured it was a watchmaker's mark or some old hobbyist thing. I closed the case and put the watch on my own wrist, 2 sizes too loose, because it was his, and because I wasn't ready to put him in a box. My parents sold the house in under a month. My father called it getting ahead of the market, like he was doing my grandfather a favor by erasing the last place he'd existed. He told me, when I objected, "Honey, he doesn't need it anymore." They split the small amount it brought, after the back taxes, between the 3 of them. My parents and my brother. Nobody offered me a dime, which was fine because I wouldn't have touched it. They didn't ask about the watch. They didn't ask about anything. There was nothing of him they wanted. I went back to work and tried to fold myself back into my life. The shifts, the charting, the grocery runs, the small apartment, the routine that's supposed to hold you up when you've got nothing else. But the watch kept catching on things. The strange mark inside it. The blacked out discharge papers. The old man at the funeral who knew my grandfather but not his own name, apparently. The way Walt had said he'd been in worse rooms. I'm a person who needs the chart to add up, and his didn't. About 2 months after he died, I got an envelope at work. A real paper letter, which almost nobody sends anymore. It was an invitation to a regional ceremony, a dedication of a new wing at a veterans care facility a few towns over. I'd done some volunteer hours there during nursing school, and my name was apparently still on a list. I almost didn't go. But it was a Saturday and I was tired of my own apartment, so I put on a decent dress, and without really thinking about it, I clasped my grandfather's watch onto my wrist, the way I did most mornings by then. It had stopped being a mystery and started being a habit, the same way it had been for him. The ceremony was the usual. Folding chairs, a podium, men in dress uniforms, and men in VFW caps. Speeches about service and sacrifice that I'd heard 100 versions of. I shook hands in a slow line afterward, exchanged the polite nothings you exchange. And then I reached a retired colonel. I knew the Eagles even on a man out of uniform. Somebody had introduced him earlier. And his hand stopped halfway to mine, and the world narrowed down to the watch on my wrist and the look on his face. He pulled himself together fast, the way men like that do. But I'd already seen it. He took my hand, finally, and held it a beat too long, his eyes on the watch the whole time. He asked my grandfather's name. I told him, Walter Pruitt. Something moved behind his eyes when I said it, like a door closing somewhere far back in the house. He took a card from his jacket, wrote a number on the back, and pressed it into my palm. Call me Monday, he said. Please. It's important. Then he was talking to the next person in line like nothing had happened, and I was standing there holding a business card and feeling like the floor had tilted. I called him Monday. His name was Colonel Daniel Everett, retired, and he asked if I could come see him in person rather than do this over the phone. He gave me an address that turned out to be a small brick building beside a VFW post, not a base, not anything official looking. There was a flag out front and a woman at a desk who looked up when I gave my name and said, "He's expecting you," like I was overdue. Colonel Everett's office had no medals on the walls, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a framed black and white photo of a row of young men in front of a cinder block building. No insignia I could make out, all of them squinting into hard sunlight. He stood when I came in. He looked at the watch first and my face second. I owe you an apology, he said. For Saturday, I made a scene. You recognized it, I said. I did. How? He sat down heavily, like the question had weight. Because I have one almost exactly like it, he said. He pulled back his own sleeve, and there it was, the same plain steel watch, the same band worn soft. Mine's got a different mark inside, but it came from the same place, the same people. I asked, what people? He was quiet for a while, the kind of quiet my grandfather used to do, where you could tell a man was deciding how much of something he was allowed to hand you. Your grandfather, he finally said, was part of something that doesn't have a name you'd find written down. We weren't a unit you could look up. We did work that the country needed done and then needed to pretend was never done. There are no records because the point was that there'd be no records. If we did the job right, nothing happened. If we did it wrong, nothing happened either officially. Either way, nothing happened. That's why his discharge papers were blacked out, I said. Why the VA wouldn't verify him. Why I couldn't get him an honor guard. Everett nodded slowly, and I watched something like shame cross his face. He'd have hated the fuss anyway, he said. But yes, the men I served with don't exist on paper the way other veterans do. The system that protected us when we were alive abandons us pretty thoroughly when we're not. I'm sorry you had to bury him without it. It wasn't right. None of it was ever right, but that part especially. I asked about the mark. He reached across the desk like he wanted to touch the watch, and then thought better of it. It's not decoration, he said. It's identification. A man in our line of work couldn't carry a dog tag, couldn't carry papers, couldn't carry anything that named him. But you needed a way, in certain rooms, for the right people to know who you were and that you could be trusted. So you carried something small and ordinary, with a mark inside it that meant something to maybe a few dozen men in the world. Your grandfather's mark means he was cleared for the work almost nobody was cleared for. The work you didn't come back from, more often than not. I thought about my grandfather winding that watch every night of his life. It reminds me what I'm made of. I had to put my hand over my mouth. My family thought he was nothing, I said, when I could talk again. My parents treated him like a burden. My mother said he liked to pretend he was special. They let him die alone. My voice did something I didn't plan. I was the only one in that hospital room. Everett didn't flinch from it. That's the cost, he said. Not the part you think. The dying alone. That happens to a lot of men, important or not. The part that costs is the silence. He couldn't tell them. He couldn't defend himself. A man who can't say what he did just looks like a man who didn't do anything. Your grandfather chose that. He chose it knowing exactly what it would cost him at his own dinner table. That's the bravest thing about him, and it's the thing nobody will ever put on a plaque. I asked him, because I had to, did he ever say he was lonely? The colonel looked at the photograph on his wall for a long moment. He never used that word, he said. But he told me once. We were old men by then, just two guys at a reunion that wasn't on any calendar. He told me the price of keeping a secret your whole life is that you spend your whole life a little bit alone, even in a room full of family. He said he'd made his peace with it. I'm not sure I believed him, but he said it. Everett had something else for me. He went to a cabinet and took out a battered metal box, the kind you'd keep important documents in, and set it on the desk between us. These aren't official, he said. They're personal. They were given to me to hold by another man from our group when he passed, with instructions to find the right person someday. I think you might be the right person. He slid it across. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, in different hands, on different paper. Some yellowed almost to brown. Not letters from my grandfather. Letters to him, from men I'd never heard of. Men who signed only first names or initials or nothing at all. I read them that night, all of them, sitting on my motel bed with the watch on my wrist. They thanked him for things that didn't fully make sense out of context. One thanked him for getting a family of 4 across a border in the dark. One thanked him for carrying a wounded man 11 miles and never once suggesting they leave him. One, in a shaky elderly hand, thanked him for keeping a name out of his mouth under conditions the writer would not describe. Conditions that the writer said he still didn't sleep through 40 years later. You taught us the hardest jobs are the ones where nobody ever finds out you were there, one of them said. I read that line maybe 10 times. My grandfather had spent his last years being asked every Thanksgiving whether he was still rattling around that old house alone. And he just smiled and asked if anybody wanted more coffee. I drove home and I did something I'd been too angry to do for 2 months. I went to my parents' house and I sat them both down, my brother on speakerphone because he was slammed, and I told them. Not all of it. I didn't have all of it, but enough. The colonel, the watch, the mark, the letters. The men he'd carried and crossed borders and kept silent for. The reason the VA couldn't verify a man who'd done more than the men they bury with bugles. I'd expected to enjoy it, honestly. I'd expected to feel some hard satisfaction watching them realize. But that's not how it went. My mother started to cry partway through. The quiet kind. And my father got very still. And my brother on the phone said, "Wait, are you serious?" in a small voice I hadn't heard from him since we were kids. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel terrible," I said. Though part of me had been. I'm telling you because somebody finally told me, and he deserved to have somebody know. My father said after a long time, "I thought he just didn't like us." He said it like it explained everything, and maybe to him it did. He was so closed off. I thought there was nothing there. I thought he was hiding that there was nothing there. He was hiding that there was everything there, I said. He just wasn't allowed to show you. My mother wiped her face with the back of her hand. He never asked us for anything, she said, and I understood she meant it as a defense. He asked you to sit with him, I said. He asked you to show up. You just didn't recognize it as asking. My brother was quiet on the line, and then he said, I sent flowers to the wrong place. I didn't even get the funeral home right. His voice cracked. God, I didn't even get that right. We didn't fix it that night. You don't fix 20 years in one living room. But something shifted that I didn't expect. My father, who had spent his entire life measuring people by what they'd accumulated, sat there looking like a man who just learned his ruler had no numbers on it. We did some small things after. They weren't grand, and my grandfather would have hated grand. We didn't issue a press release or name a building. Colonel Everett helped us, quietly, work through the right channels to have my grandfather's service formally acknowledged. Not declassified, nothing like that. Just enough that the marker on his grave could say United States Army without it being a lie anyone would have to defend. It took months. The government does not hurry to admit a man existed after spending decades insisting he didn't, but it came through. My parents paid for the new headstone without being asked. They didn't put his rank on it because we didn't entirely know it and because it felt right not to. It says his name, the years, and underneath, he carried what he could not name. I wrote that part. The stonecutter asked me twice if I was sure. My parents started going with me to the Veterans Center, the one where the ceremony had been. Not for show. They go on a Tuesday afternoon and sit with old men who wanted to talk and old men who didn't, and they learn the difference between the two. My father, who used to fill silences with questions about other people's failures, learned to just sit in them. My mother lights a candle on my grandfather's birthday now. She told me she does it because she spent so many of his birthdays not thinking about him at all. And she's trying to make the math come out closer to even, though we both know it won't. A few months later, a last letter came. This one from Colonel Everett himself. He was moving into a care facility, his own health going the way of all things, and he wanted me to have a note before he couldn't write it. He said my grandfather had once told him that the highest form of service was making the world a little better and not needing anyone to know you'd done it. He said that kind of man was getting rarer and that the world was poorer for it, and would I please not let what I knew die with me. I keep that letter in the metal box with the others now. The box doesn't feel like a place where secrets are buried anymore. It feels like a bridge between the part of him that had to stay hidden and the part of him that finally got to be seen. The morning the headstone was set, I drove out to the little cemetery on the edge of Marwood by myself before my parents got there. It's not much of a place. No marble angels, no long flags, just a slope of grass under some old oaks with the sound of the county road behind it, the kind of place you'd drive past your whole life and never once look at, which felt exactly right for him. I knelt and brushed the leaves off the new stone and read it again. He carried what he could not name, and I took the watch off my wrist and held it in my hand. The steel had gone warm from my skin. He'd warmed it the same way for 60 years. I thought about all the years I'd sat with him on his porch while my family laughed inside without him, both of us watching the same trees, me thinking I was keeping a lonely old man company, and him, maybe, keeping me. I thought about the men in the letters, the family he got across the border in the dark, the name he never gave up, and I thought about how he spent his last years being treated like he'd never done a single thing that mattered, and how he let them think it, because the alternative meant breaking a promise he'd made to men who couldn't speak for themselves. I used to think strength was the loud kind. Promotions, titles, the corner office, the thing you could frame and hang on the wall. That's how my parents measured a life, and it's how they measured my grandfather and found him wanting. For a long time, I measured him the same way without knowing it. I felt sorry for him, this quiet man rattling around an empty house, and pity is just contempt. That's learned some manners. I had it exactly backwards. He wasn't a small man who'd done nothing. He was a large man who'd agreed to look small for the rest of his life so that other people could go on living theirs. The silence wasn't emptiness. The silence was the size of what he was holding. My parents arrived while I was still kneeling there. They came up quiet and stood beside me, one on each side, and for a while none of us said anything, which would have made my grandfather laugh. The three of us finally good at sitting in a silence with him, now that he couldn't see it. My father spoke first. I spent my whole life trying to prove I was somebody, he said, to the stone more than to us. And I never once looked at the one man in the family who already was. My mother put her hand flat on the top of the headstone. The way you put a hand on someone's shoulder. I thought being strong meant being seen, she said. He knew it was the other thing. He knew it the whole time, and he never made us feel stupid for not knowing. My brother had driven down too, the first time he'd been to that grave. He'd missed the funeral. And I think the headstone was as close as he could get to apologizing for it. He looked at the grass for a long while and finally said, I always thought he was invisible. He wasn't invisible. He just decided he didn't need us to see him. We stayed longer than we meant to. It didn't feel like visiting a grave. It felt, for the first time in my life, like the four of us were finally in a room with him and actually listening. I put the watch back on before I left. 2 sizes too loose, the way I like it. I wear it every day now. I wind it every night, 2 careful turns, the way he did. And most nights I think about what it means, and some nights I just think about him. It's not a secret to me anymore. It's an instruction. Pay attention to the quiet ones. The people who don't take up the air in a room. The ones who do the thing and never mention the thing. The ones at the edge of the table you keep forgetting to ask about, because the world has trained you to believe that anybody worth knowing would have already told you. I'm still a nurse. I still believe in showing up, and being the steady one in the worst room a family will ever stand in. But the watch changed how I do it. When somebody's family gathers around a bed now, I look for the quiet one in the corner. The one nobody's translating for. And I make sure that person gets a chair and gets heard. Because I know now what it costs to be the one who held everything and said nothing. My family learned that lesson far too late from my grandfather. But we learned it. We talk differently now. We measure less and we listen more, and when the quietest person at the table finally starts to say something, nobody talks over him anymore. We lean in. We wait. We let the silence be as big as it needs to be. For most of my life, I measured my grandfather the way my parents taught me to, by what showed on the surface, and that was the mistake that cost us all those years. Walter never corrected anyone. He let my father believe he was a man who had done nothing, because the alternative meant breaking his word to people who couldn't speak for themselves. I understand now that keeping that promise for 60 years took a kind of strength I'd never once had to find. It would have been so easy for him to talk. One story at one Thanksgiving and the whole family would have treated him like royalty. He chose the harder thing every single day, quietly, and nobody ever clapped for it. What I keep coming back to is how much of this came down to choices, his and ours. He chose to carry what he couldn't name. My parents chose not to look any closer, and that small refusal hardened over 20 years into treating a good man like a problem in the basement. I chose, almost by accident, to show up at a hospital bed when everyone else stayed home, and that one decision is the only reason any of us ever learned the truth. Cause and effect, all the way down. Nothing in this story happened by luck. It happened because people decided who they were going to be and then lived it out, day after day, until the bill came due. If Walter's life handed me anything worth passing on, it's that the person I want to become needs 3 things. And they're not the things my family spent their lives chasing. A spine of plain decency that holds even when no one is watching, the way his did in rooms I will never be allowed to know about. The clear eyes to look past whatever is loudest and actually see what's standing in front of you, which is the very thing my parents never managed, and I nearly missed myself. And the staying power to keep doing the right, unglamorous thing for years without applause, because the world almost never pays you back in the same moment you earn it. I think about Kearney Everett's letter more than I expected to. He wrote that men like my grandfather were getting rare and that we'd all be poorer when they were gone. I don't want to just nod at that and move on. I want to be a little more like Walter, steadier, gentler with the quiet ones, slower to mistake silence for emptiness. I wear his watch every day and I wind it every night, 2 careful turns, and somewhere along the way, the winding stopped being a habit and became a promise. To pay attention. To show up. To do the work and never need a single soul to know I did it. That's what he left me. Not a secret, an instruction. And I mean to keep it.